Live. We have an incredible week coming up or happening now, and I'm absolutely thrilled to have Carlotta Rinaldi as our guest today on Vinous Live. Carlotta, thanks so much for your time. It's a pleasure. Sorry to drag you away from the vineyards, but you've got many fans all over the world who will be really thrilled to have some of your time today. So thanks for joining.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pretty great lineup that you have in the next few days. So feel a little bit the pressure, but
no, I feel pressure. Well, so the whole goal with these seminars and these conversations is obviously the world is in a pretty unusual state right now, and hopefully these talks are a way of kind of bringing us together, since we can't physically visit or go see you or go to your vineyard. So that's sort of the spirit here, and we like to keep this as interactive as possible. So we'll get lots of questions from our audience. I'd like everybody to who's watching to please give us your questions as soon as they come into your mind, because that way we can plan the conversation a little more. If we get the questions at the end, which sometimes happen, it's sort of a kind of a mad rush. So don't be shy, fire away. She's great. And we're going to have a really fun conversation here. So, well, first and foremost, obviously, we're still grappling, obviously, with this COVID crisis, and we will for a while. So I hope you and your family are okay, your workers.
Yeah, thanks for asking. Yeah, we're good. We were, very lucky in agriculture in general to be able to keep on working and maintaining some kind of routine throughout all this time. There was plenty of work out in the vineyards, so the team was out. I mean, it's a very small team, but we were all out, and we had a quite a nice and sunny spring. So there was plenty to do outside. But yeah, we're looking forward to a little bit of normal, coming back to normal, and supporting the main friends who are not as lucky, and restaurateurs and everything that are still shut down. So we'll see in the next few weeks how everything's going to go.
Yeah, businesses are starting to open this week, right? In Italy, aren't they?
Yeah. Just a few businesses since the last Monday, and not yet restaurants or anything else. So.
Oops. You hate that when you don't mute your phone. Excellent. Okay, good. And what's the status of the vineyard right now?
So we have been finishing the shoot thinning. So what we're doing now is organizing the canopy and making everything kind of straight and organized. And I think we are a couple of weeks earlier than normal. We're going to be look for flowering not too far ahead. And then, we're going to start the lateral shoot removal in a little bit of time, but everything looks all right. We had a little bit of rain in the last actually today, but yeah, everything looks okay. Not too warm. We had a little bit of a risk of frost about a month ago, but everything looked okay. So yeah, we're happy for the moment. Still early. So.
And you're predicting a slightly early harvest than normal, right? At this stage?
Yeah, for the moment it looks a little bit earlier. So we'll see when the flowering happens, but it's not as bad as other wine regions I've heard.
Yeah. So I think it'd be interesting. So obviously you represent a very historic winery in Piedmont, and I think the first time I visited your parents would have been like 20 years ago, something like that. Your dad, first he talked to me for like an hour, which is pretty good, because it could have been like 2, which was fun. And then we tasted some wine, and then
so you managed to taste some wine.
I did manage to taste some.
A lot of time people went there and then never really got to taste anything. Went away.
No, I got to taste. But then at the end, I asked him if I could buy a few bottles of wine, and he said he was just in a very bad mood, I guess. I don't know. He said, okay, fine. And he had this little corner where he had all these vintages stacked up, because people, I think, forget that it's only recently that high quality estates sell all of their production basically immediately.
Yeah.
It was quite customary that a winery would have several vintages available for sale at any given time, and that's not that long ago. So he had maybe 5 or 6 vintages, and so I maybe bought like a few of these different vintages, and then when I went to pay, he was almost like embarrassed to take my money, and it's just there's just something very I don't know, beautiful about things that are kind of, you felt like it must have been like that for decades, and I just think that there's something, so of all of the wines that I have in my cellar, I probably have more Rinaldi than anything else, maybe with the exception of your cousin's wine, and for a while it was Bruno Giacosa and Conterno, but those are like the cellars that I have the most of. So I've loved these wines for a really long time. I didn't open a wine. Usually I have a wine on this show, but I didn't open any bottles of yours because I keep them all off site, so I don't drink them. But I have a couple of empties. This is 96 Reserva, and this is 99. Also, used to call it Barolo delle Brunate Riserva Speciale. But your family has a fascinating history. And I would love it if you could share it for our viewers to sort of set the context of how your present day domain came to be.
Sure. So me and my sister Marta, we are currently the 5th generation in the Rinaldi family. Everything dates back to the 1800s, 1870, when the Barelle Rinaldi estate was established in Barolo. It was one of the first wineries with the purpose of actually vinifying, which was established here. There were really quite a few. Before then, you got to think that there was one and only family that for centuries were working the land and were vinifying, and all the families were farming and selling the grapes to the family Falletti. The last Falletti, the wife of the last Falletti, Tancredi, she was a French noblewoman, Juliette Colbert, who passed away in 1864, did not have any descendants. So the family disappeared, unfortunately. She was very ambitious, and she created some charity organization called Opera Pia Barolo. And when she died, she left all the properties to some of the family farming the lands for the family for a very long time, and some of them to the Opera Pia Barolo, which is still existing and is still working with the same regulation that she settled. So you got to think that until then, all the family were just farmers. Nobody was actually really thinking about vinifying too much. There were examples of it. GB Burlotto in Verduno, family Donati, Vignolo Lutati in Castigliol Falletto. Some of them, in fact, they started vinifying and making wine around 1870, 1880. And that's how the family Rinaldi, together with the family Barale, started. The winery was not where we are now. So the Barale Rinaldi was in a house which is still existing, and now is the property of Francesco Rinaldi in Cannumbi Boschis. And the Barale Rinaldi kept on producing and making wines until basically the beginning of the 1900s, 1920 most likely. Then they decided to split, and so they divided the surface of land, and from the Barale Rinaldi, Giuseppe Rinaldi was founded, Fratelli Barale and Francesco Rinaldi, 3 of them still existing now, of course. And Giuseppe Rinaldi, so my great-grandfather, started building the house and the winery where we are now. Between 1916 and 1922, and most likely the first vintage that we found is the one that you're showing, so 1921, with the label of Giuseppe Rinaldi. Giuseppe Rinaldi had 3 daughters and 1 son, Battista Rinaldi, my grandfather, who was an enologist because he studied at the Scuola Enologica in Alba, and then he had a military career. So he quite late after the wars came back to the winery and took over. He was very much driven by a sense of community, a sense of being heavily involved in the politics and in the interest of this area. That's why he was mayor of Barolo for during the 70s, and that's thanks to him as well that the Castello di Barolo, for example, was acquired by the village, by the citizens of Barolo. This year, it's in fact the 50th anniversary of the acquisition. He was the first president of the Enoteca Regionale. So he was very much driven by this sense of building a community for making something better out of this land. He had two sons, so Giuseppe, my dad, and Paolo, who unfortunately passed away very young. My dad, he studied as well as an enologist at the Scuola Enologica, and then he decided to do something else, to follow another path. He graduated as a vet, as a veterinarian, and he that was a Festa del Barolo.
First one.
And so he practiced as a vet for 15, 20 years. He had this love for the Piemontese breed, cow breed. And then it was just at the end of the 80s that he decided to be involved 100% in the winery. And then after that, my grandfather passed away in '92, and he took over completely. My sister, who is a little bit older than me, Marta, she studied as well at the Enology School of Alba. Then she graduated in viticulture and enology, and so she got involved right after the studies in the work of the cellar. And then after a while, after a few years, I joined too, and quite slowly, we were able to work side by side with my dad for a few years. My sister, she's very involved, and since the beginning, she was quite involved in the winery management. Somehow I got involved more in the vineyard management. So I did my studies in agricultural sciences. And after a few years, I joined and took over the management of the vineyards. Straight away, I really quite observed and worked with my dad, who was then slightly more focused on the vineyards. And then by 2015, 2016, I was more responsible of what was happening out in the vineyards.
Yeah, and here's a picture with your sister at the dinner that we did. I guess that was last year, the dinner with all of your wines at Nomad, which we hope will open and be even better than it was before. But this was a fantastic evening. We tasted your wines back to, I think 78 was the oldest that we had, all from Magnums. So that's that picture of that night. So one of the things that happened when your dad took over is he believed very much in the concept of blending and making wines with multiple vineyards, which is the way that Barolo has traditionally been made. So what are your thoughts on the idea of whether the expression of Barolo is really a single vineyard, or is it more of a blend?
Apparently, my grandfather as well was already blending. It was very much year by year by then, but my dad used to say that most likely the blends, especially with the Brunate, were quite similar to what then he introduced. What I think that it's it's a very diverse and a diverse area, ours, and potential of putting together and balancing out characters who can be slightly extreme in one vineyard more than one other, to make a more harmonious wine is a plus. So we still believe in the blend. Of course, you got to consider that we're facing vintages which are completely different to what it was 50 years ago, and maybe there is slightly less of the need of blending. I guess that with the extreme, especially September, October, that they used to have, very humid, very cold, some expression of vineyards were probably even more underlined and quite edgy. And so the fact of putting them together and balancing out the slightly too strong acidity or like presence of tannins was definitely more needed than what it is now. But we still believe very much that by blending, we are able to get more harmony. We always blend at the end of the aging. So we usually try to keep the vineyards separated for all the process, so fermentation and then élevage. So yeah, at the moment, the blends are slightly different than what my dad was doing due to regulations. So the two blends now at the moment are Barolo Brunate and Barolo Tretine. Barolo Brunate, even though we're not able to put that on the label, is the blend of Brunate plus Le Coste. And the other blend is Cannubi San Lorenzo, Ravera, and Le Coste. So those four parcels are the historical parcels that my family has inherited through the years. And yeah, we combine them in this way. The Barolo Brunate with Le Coste. In that case, in the case of Brunate and Le Coste, I really quite feel that the presence of Le Coste kind of underlines and enhance even more the greatness of Brunate. So Brunate is quite, it goes pretty much in every direction. It has, my dad used to call it Brunate as onnicomprensivo. So it kind of, yeah, covered every direction, no? It has tractors, but then it has brightness and it has an aromatic profile. And I believe that the presence of Le Coste, the presence of Le Coste even underlines it, even enlighten it even more. Tretine.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Tretine, which was the former Cannubi San Lorenzo Ravera, now at the moment has a small addition of Le Coste. And that in the Tretine, the most present in percentage is Ravera. So we own a parcel in Ravera di Barolo. Ravera is this menzione which covers mostly the area belonging to the village of Novello, and then just a small part of it, it's still belonging to the village of Barolo, just underneath Terlo, in the ridge of Paiagallo, Terlo, etc. And that's definitely the most, it's the one and only east-facing vineyard that we have next to the forest, is usually the one that has the brightest acidity. It's a very linear wine, and adding it Cannubi San Lorenzo gets slightly more in both of direction, we feel. So And Le Coste as well. Le Coste has a quite similar soil profile to Cannubi San Lorenzo. So in a way, they're quite similar to one another.
So to help people get situated, your wine, for people who have been to see you, your winery is in Le Coste.
It's in Le Coste, sì.
And when you look out from the place where your dad pointed a rifle at me once,
Yeah.
you can see that.
People are not going to come anymore.
Huh? What?
People are not going to come visit anymore.
His point, but I think he was just kidding. But anyway, you can see the chabot that your dad built, and that's Ravera.
That's
correct?
Ravera.
Yeah.
So Le Coste develops, and there is the little Menzione Rivassi, which is a small amphitheater, and then it ends up on the Ravera. And it's just like Ravera di Barolo is a few hectares. We own 3 hectares there, so I believe it's like not more than 5 hectares total. And then it starts up to Ravera di Novello. There is quite a difference in Ravera di Novello and Ravera di Barolo. Ravera di Novello kind of, it's almost on the other side of the hill. It sees very much and is quite facing the Alps. So there is a whole lot of different conditions of climate conditions, of currents coming directly from the mountains and everything.
And it's higher.
And it's higher, yeah.
Ravera di Novello, for folks watching, that's where El Vilcogno is, where Vietti is, that's sort of perched on top there. Rivassi, for folks who are watching, is one of the vineyards where Sandrone makes their new wine called Tallinn, is from Rivassi.
Yeah,
There. And the image that we showed a few minutes ago was the 92 and the 93. The 92 is the last vintage that you have, Brunate. 93, your dad had changed to Brunate Le Coste. But you articulated something that I've never heard anybody say as precisely as you have. And of course, you just took it for granted, but it's a really beautiful insight that I think people should pay attention to, because it's just there's a couple of very fundamental concepts that you just articulated a few minutes ago. One was how different the vintages were 50 years ago. And you talked about the rain at harvest time, which was the biggest thing that penalized vintages back in the 60s and 70s, was rain right at the end of right before or during harvest. And if you talk to people who are older, like Mauro Mascarello or Angelo Gaia, they'll tell you that they would go to sleep at night during harvest and hear the rain on the roof. And this was obviously a great source of anxiety. Another concept that is related is the idea that Barolo and Barbaresco were traditionally made of blends. As blends. But I've never heard anybody say that part of the reason for that was because you had much more variability in weather. Therefore, the performance of vineyards was much more variable, and therefore you needed to blend to compensate, because you might have a better vintage over here than over there. And I think that that's a really interesting way to look at it, that the blending was partially driven by the uneven performance of vineyards at a time when the climate was much more irregular. I mean, it's irregular now too for different reasons, but back then you could get a lot of rain at the very worst moment. And so you needed the blend, and you sort of glossed over it because to you it's very natural, but to people, I don't think everybody might understand it quite the way you explained it. What you're saying is today the vintages are much more higher quality because Piedmont has been a beneficiary of climate change. So far, knock on wood. So in a decade of 10 years, you might have 7 or 8 really good years, whereas 50 years ago, in a decade of 10, you might have had 7 or 8 not so good years.
Yeah.
And while vintages may be extreme now for different reasons, the quality level is higher. Maybe you don't need to balance these vineyards out so much anymore because they're each stronger on their own. And I think those are really great insights. I've never really heard anybody explain it that way. So
yeah, it's Piemonte it's true that it was kind of beneficiary at least at the moment, but still you get extremes of situations, and it's like the heat spikes that now we have, or the average temperatures that we have during winter. We have no more winter. I remember as a kid that the winter for me meant having snow on the ground, and the snow was staying on the ground for quite a long time. Now to see snowing, it's like, wow, it's amazing. So, and even if you think that 2014, it is considered as a cold year. We all know, like, it's a cold, classic, very humid year. At the end of the day, if you think about the yearly sums of temperatures, it's a warm one, because not because, of course, the spring or of the summer or until the harvest, but because of the winter. There was no winter. So and the heat spikes, yeah, as I was saying, 19 just last June, I probably saw some of the worst sunburns that I have ever seen. And I don't recall my dad talking about sunburns. I don't recall reading on my granddad's diary talking about sunburns. And people are now, producers are now thinking about the treatments to do to avoid sunburns. So products covering the bunches, the green bunches that can be mostly affected by sunburns. So yes, it's been beneficiary for the last couple of months, but in all things considered, is a little bit scary from other point of view, and it makes you completely reconsider as well the management of the example. Traditionally, Nebbiolo, which has such vigor at some stage over the vegetative cycle, you had to open it and you have to avoid humidity around the bunches. So taking out lateral leaves, lateral shoots, and sometimes even later in the ripening leaves. Now you got to cover, you got to create shade. So it's a whole lot of different considerations that makes you being a little bit more careful about the whole management of the soil as well, creating and maintaining as much as possible cover crops, natural cover crops, or cover crops just seeded with but yeah, so that's Brunate.
Yeah.
So that's the vineyard of Brunate. Our parcel in Brunate is quite large, considering the surface that we own totally. So it's 1.2 hectares. It's the part of Brunate which is still in the village of Barolo. The main part of Brunate belongs actually to La Morra. Brunate is almost 30 hectares, so it's a quite large menzione, mostly from belonging to La Morra. Just the lowest side of it is already in Barolo. Our parcel develops quite alongside the hill. And it has slight different situations from the soil profile from one to the other. This is the upper side of it. Above there is the parcel of Francesco Rinaldi. Historically, when the Barella Rinaldi was still existing, they were all together. That side is the least vigorous side of Brunate. The soil is slightly poor compared to the main central part of Brunate. Usually the vines have less crop as well. They are slightly behind maybe in the ripening as well. Then it develops down in the hill, in the main central Brunate. That was when historically, when it used to snow, the snow used to go away first. And then it develops down, cutting the hill in two. And that's where probably there is the most profound and deep soil. It's a very clay, powerful soil. And it's from that vineyard, I've selected throughout the years some interesting vines for the mussel selection. And so, yeah, we'll see how we go from it.
Yeah. So what you're talking about is the traditional concept of how people once upon a time used to evaluate the quality of vineyards. It was the places where the snow melted the first, because those were the warmer sites, and the soris, the upper hillsides. Today, maybe people have a different concept of what a good quality vineyard is, but traditionally that was the construct, right? The places where the snow melts the first were considered the best.
Yeah, so this side of coming down, you see above La Morra, and so there is the whole ridge, starting with Fossati, Sarmassa, Cerecchio, and then Brunate, all completely south-facing, except some part of Cerecchio, which is southwest, but Brunate is this side which is completely south-facing.
And I'm sorry.
No, it was my dad really very much used to call it as onnicomprensivo, because both practically and then more maybe going down in the soil characters, it was where there was very little risk of hailstorm, where there was very little risk of frosts. The soil was a soil that with very little stones, not at all stony, so no chalks, which back in time used to be a plus, as the constructions of the vineyards were done all by hand. So all the conceptions around greatness of some vineyards were mainly linked to practical reasons. And then, of course, throughout the years, and already the old people knew that the Brunate was Brunate, and tasting something from Brunate was because there was some particular character coming out from it.
Yeah. So 1.2 hectares, do you harvest that all together, or do the parcels ripen very differently?
We do. Nowadays, we harvest it all together. My grandfather used to sometimes harvest it in different moments, but I'm not sure actually if it was because of practical reasons. Back then, they didn't really have the same tractors that we have. So just even moving from the Rinaldi winery to the Brunate was a trip. And so sometimes maybe it was just because of practical reasons. I'm not sure if it was because of ripening reasons, I guess. I like the fact that there are these slight differences in ripening, and from one the end of the vineyard and the beginning of the vineyard, where you see kind of differences in the ripening, but then put it all together, maybe it's part of the complexity that you can get in the Brunate.
So when I took those pictures of the vineyard, that was in 2017. Mm-hmm. It was right after we did the first vertical of your wines in London that Martha went to. I remember at the time you talked just now about changes in cover crops and leafing, but back then I remember you talked a lot about the changes in pruning also. And is that a climate change reaction, or is that just kind of where you want to take the direction of the vineyard?
No, so the introduction of a different pruning system was based on the fact of these many people, both in Italy and France, taking back an old pruning French technique for great results on prevention of wood diseases, which in some regions are really, really quite a problem, like talking about Esca, for example. I've got to say that, especially on Nebbiolo, we don't have the same incidence and problems of wood diseases as in other varieties. So the interest in that pruning system was just because of the physiological thought, which was based for the pruning system itself. So it is called Guyot Poussard, and the result is not different because we still have a Guyot with one fruit cane. It's just a different considerations on the cuts that you do. So how width the cuts can be, which are space for all the fungi system to enter the vines, and the attention that you pay to the set flow of the vine itself. So you usually on the normal Guyot leave one spur and one fruit cane. In this particular pruning system, you usually leave 2 spurs and 1 fruit cane, and the 2 spurs are usually external, following the 2-step flow that the vines has. It's based on the fact that compared to many other plants, like for example the fruit trees, the vine has a very compartmented, separated flows, sap flows. It is considered that what roots on the right, for example, the right side on the vine can absorb from the soil, stay on the right side of the canopy as well. The left-hand side of the root system takes up nutrient and is stay on the left-hand side of the canopy. So these studies were done by François Dahl in Loire Valley, by the Simone Tensirk group in Italia. And I thought that was just making, me and Marta thought that it was just making a lot of sense. And nowadays I wouldn't be able to prune in any other way. And my dad was around, so he was aware and he was present to this shift very slowly. About 6 years ago, we started converting all the vineyards and from the Nebbiolo to the Barbera to Dolcetto, Freisa, everything.
Yeah. So for folks who don't know, Esca is, as you said, it's a vine disease. It's a fungus that rots the vine from the inside out, and there's no cure to it. It just kills the plant. So the only real treatment is either these pruning things, or Simone and Cirque, as you mentioned, they have this technique of cutting out the fungus, which they use in Champagne and Bordeaux and other places, but it's pretty manually intensive and I'm sure pretty expensive.
Yeah, we have been trying to do it on the Nebbiolo. It takes a lot of time, but it's for sure very valuable, and there are great studies. It's still quite an early study technique, so it's going to need a little bit of time to develop. But there are great results in Bordeaux, in Loire as well.
Yeah, and it's been particularly devastating though for Barbera so far. Much worse for Barbera than Nebbiolo. One of the reasons that this disease exists is because something you talked about before, which is there's no more winter. Traditionally, the winter would have been the cold winter months would have been the time that would kill these pests and not allow them to flourish. But now you have warmer winters, and so these organisms are allowed, they live through the winter, and then they give you problems, correct?
Yeah, it's valuable as well for downy mildew and oidium, and so yeah, that's definitely having an impact from any point of view.
So we've got some really cool questions. I'm going to take them and maybe paraphrase a little bit, but in terms of climate change, then I want to know what you're drinking. At least one of us is having wine, and I still have to work. But so in terms of climate change, have you noticed the difference between the way different vineyards have responded, or like something like Ravera, is that more protected than say Brunate, or?
I think that what is forcing us to do climate change is think about no more the whole vineyard itself or the whole surface that you have, but a really kind of site-specific approach. There is a part of Le Coste which I realized that is behaving and is most affected by heat, for example, than the other side of it. So it's kind of makes you to connect to a more maybe an overlooking to few rows of the same plot itself. I wouldn't say that any of the great vineyards less interesting. Probably what you get is that vineyards that were less interesting, or not less interesting, but just for Nebbiolo, slightly more difficult because it was just not really ripening every year in what was the best. Now there is not at all problem. And Ravera is a result of it, as Luca Corrado has said, I think in New York at La Festa. So yeah, I think that the impact of it is some sites becoming more and more interesting than the great vineyards losing something.
Yeah, I mean, so far the wines would certainly support that. A couple of people have asked about the future of the winery and acquisitions and things, and I know that you've got this new parcel in Busia. So tell us about your new wine from there, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, this was, I think it was a project that was in my dad's mind since years. He never really got the chance. I've got to say that he was just interested in our parcel of Brunate, or our parcel next to ours in Le Coste or in Nubi, never going too far away, which is a valuable thing, of course, for a small team and winery like we have. But yeah, in 2018, in the spring of 2018, it was actually unfortunately already sick. We got informed that there was this parcel and the previous tenant was not interested to renew the lease. And so we checked it out and it was quite a good spot. And then the year went on not in the great way. So it's something that we kept aside, but my dad kept on talking about it until the end. And so it took a while to kind of get our head around it. But then me, my sister, and my dad, and my mom, we decided to jump in it. And so at the beginning of 19, we rented it. So we signed a lease, and it's a vineyard of 1.3 hectares. So it's quite large. Some of it is Dolcetto and some of it is Nebbiolo. It's in historically, just located is where there is the Borgata Bussia Sottana. So for people who have maybe visited the winery, Giacomo Fenocchio is just above it. And 2019, so was the first vintage, was the first season that we followed completely. It's definitely early to say. I think that you gotta develop a certain intimacy with the vineyards, and one season is not enough. So this year, last year, 19 was interesting. It's the first time that we deal with a southwest facing vineyard. Some of it is completely south, but some of it just in this amphitheater, and one side is southwest. So for example, in the case of these heat spikes, the Bussia was slightly touched, especially the western side of it, as it sees the afternoon sun, which in this case is quite bad. So it's gonna push us to think through things more, consider different things, and the approach to the vineyard in a different way, probably from the canopy management and everything. But it's quite interesting. It's challenging, so we're happy with it. It's in barrel now, so it's in botte, separated, so still by itself. It shows for sure a kind of quite wide structure. We'll see. Yeah, we're happy with it.
Here's a picture that I took of you and your mom and your sister. This is in front of your new Tino that replaced the 100-year-old cask, Tino, sorry, that your dad famously slept in 2003. Huh? What?
Tina.
Tina, sorry. Tina, feminine. Well, look, Italian is not my first or second language, so you have to forgive me. I do my best. Latina. Latina. Good. Which it replaced the one, though, the old one that a lot of visitors to your cellar have seen, where in 2003, because it was so hot, your dad famously slept in there with a candle and a book. I don't know if it's a real story, but that's the story around the old one, which doesn't exist anymore. But in that same space, I remember this one visit. It was probably 10 years ago. No, it was around 2013. It was a late harvest because the wines were still fermenting when I came to see you in November, and there were some pump overs. And I think your sister was hosting these very well dressed two couples from Torino. I think they were like really dressed like only Italians get dressed. They looked like they walked out of a magazine, you know. And there's this wine, this must pumping over into this bin on the ground, and your dad just takes a glass and sticks it under this stream for us to taste while he's got a cigar in his hand, and the ashes on the floor. And it's just like, that's what I remember when I see that corner of the cellar, is that. So
yeah, it was a beautiful Tina. We were very sad that we had to let it go. In the same year, so 2018 was a year of big losses, and Tina was part of it as well. It meant a lot because it was there since the beginning of Giuseppe Rinaldi. At the beginning, apparently, it wasn't there, and it was higher. And it was at the beginning of the cellar where there is now part of the élevage, and there is the big 60 hectoliters botti of Cappellano. So it was back there, and it was higher. And then it got moved, cut, and it stayed there. And it was basically, the walls were built around it, so we could not take it out. And so in the August of 2018, we had to undo it by hand. Unfortunately, was showing just signs of rot at the base of it, and so we didn't want to risk all the Brunate to go. And so Garbellotto, the Cooper Garbellotto made it. It was actually 3 artisans that came for 2 days working full time, and it was an experience to see it, put it together. So wow. we hope that is going to last at least 100 years more.
Tell us what wine you're drinking.
So it's Freisa. Freisa 15. Yeah, Freisa 15. It's I thought about, I enjoyed Freisa a lot. It's a variety that unfortunately suffered a little bit the presence of Nebbiolo because it loves good spaces, loves good sides and slopes. And there are just a few hectares left, about 20 hectares left in the area of Barolo, Freisa. But I love it as a variety, as a rustic variety, and the way it grows. Also the least probably of all sensitive to diseases, to downy mildew and oidium. So it kind of gives you a little bit of breath sometimes to don't worry too much about Freisa. And I love it a little bit aged. I think it's a little bit underestimated as a variety that can age well. It's a relative of Nebbiolo. It shares the DNA with Nebbiolo, and it has this potential. So I enjoy it.
We have a couple of questions. Just want to wrap up on the Busia. That's going to be a separate wine with its own label, correct?
I think so. Yeah, most likely. Yeah, it's Brunate and Tretine, they quite have their own identity. So I don't think we'd touch them, and the Busia would be a separate label. But we still have a couple of 3 years more. Think about it.
All right, let's see how many questions we can get to. Here's one from my friend James Johnson, who says, Antonio, I know you love these wines, so do I. My only regret is I don't have more in the cellar. No problem, James. I'll open any wine you want, anytime. Can you and Carlotta share your favorite vintages, say 1980 forward? And then what do you think is special about the great vintages? So what's your favorite, what are your favorite vintages from 1980 to present?
85, I think, is a pretty reference point in general for Rinaldi as well. 89 is the times that I tasted 89, I was quite blown away. I loved 93. 93, I think there was some brightness of this cold vintage that I enjoy very much. And it's still young. So it's going to be interesting to taste it in a little bit of time. 96, love 96. It's probably one of my favorite vintages of all. Voila.
It was empty, unfortunately, but it was good.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite. 86. 99 is for sure another reference point, very classic. And 2005, 2006, 08. 08 is another reference point that I have in my mind, and if we would be able to make those kind of wines in the future and having vintages that last as long, we would be in a pretty good position.
Yeah.
I
think for me, I remember the first time I had the 85. Wow, it was in a blind tasting. It was just a total knockout. I have not had that wine very much, but boy, that 85 is fantastic. So is 89. I love the 90 that I've had a few times.
Yeah.
I love the 86 because that's the vintage that got destroyed by hail, and the wines are super concentrated. Your wine and your cousin's wine, they're just outrageously beautiful.
I've never tasted our 86. I've tasted Maria Teresa's, Bartolo Mascarello, but we have one Magnum of 86, which is up there, and we still have when I'm going to open it. So.
Can I tell you a story about the 86?
No.
No? I'm going to tell you anyway. I'm going to tell.
I didn't know. I know.
I remember visiting once your dad and your parents in the summertime, and he always liked the summertime because it was very quiet. You know, nobody goes to Piedmont in August, really. And he said, he showed me the camera that he had refurbished, which I wrote an article about. And he said, you know, it's the first, I think it's the only time your dad ever said, you want to taste an older vintage. And I know that you don't have a huge library, so I was really embarrassed. And he said, just pick an older wine that you want to taste, whatever you want. And I was so embarrassed because I know I've been down there. I know how few bottles you have. And he said, come on. He goes, it's fine. He goes, if I don't open it with you, my daughter's boyfriends are going to drink it all. So I said, well, if you put it that way. So he opened 86. I said 86.
Oh, there you go.
It's my fault. I'm sorry.
That's all right. That's all right. But you enjoyed it? It was good?
Daughter's boyfriends will drink all the wine, so open whatever you want. So that was the 86. But then 93, I love the 99, obviously. But you know, I think one of the things I've learned about buying wine is that if you like the wines of a producer, like what I do is just for myself, and what I always tell all of our readers is I would prefer to own a lot of wines from a few estates than a few wines from many estates, because I think ultimately every vintage has its moment, you know. And so I tried the wines that I like. I try to buy them in every vintage because I know that I'm going to like them at some point. And one of the wines of yours that's like that is 2009, which is not a vintage that I like that much, but I remember when we tasted it in that vertical in New York, how amazing that wine was, of which I didn't expect so much. I mean, we know 08 is great and 6 and 10, blah, 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 blah. But the 09 was really beautiful that day. And I remember the people who were sitting next to me who were, you know, Jay McInerney and Aldo Somme, people who have tasted a lot of really great wines. And everybody was just really blown away by that wine, because in that moment, it was really ready to give everything that it had. Yeah. Sure, maybe the 10 is a more important vintage, whatever, but 4 I love, 8. But in that moment, the '09 was so beautiful and so expressive. And so I just sort of think, you know, we focus a lot on the quality of vintages, but I always say they should focus on the quality of the producer more. And especially now that we live in this world where the quality of vintages is much more consistent than it ever was, the vintages aren't really the differentiator anymore. You know, I think it's the producers that are the differentiator. And so you buy the wines, well, that's what I suggest. Buy the wines of the estates that you like. And, you know, there's always going to be a moment for those. The other vintage I'm not really crazy about is 11, but we opened Maria Teresa Mascarello's 11 at the Festa del Barolo, and it was just fantastic. I mean, the bottle was like, I opened it at my table. It was the next time I looked at the bottle, it was half empty. You know, I mean, so there's a beauty in that too.
Yeah, it's it makes me think especially when we open and we drink older bottles of my grandfather, and you read through his diaries, and sometimes around the 70s, the 80s as well. You know, at that time he was bottling a botte when there was a request. So it could have been that one vintage could be aged in botte for 4 years, but then 7 or maybe 8. And it makes you think, and these wines are so still bright and young, and it makes you think if the vintages we are facing now could actually handle 5, 6, 7, 8 years in both, you know. It's something that, yeah, I've been thinking about now. In our wineries, for many reasons, practical reasons, but also because of the wines, the bottling has a specific timeline in the year, and it's after 3 years of aging. And it was actually my sister who shortened it up, probably since 2011, recognizing the fact that maybe slightly shorter aging in botte could have been beneficial in certain vintages. And I wonder if now we would be able to make wine that could handle that amount of time in botte.
Yeah, well, for sure, the chemistry of the grapes today is very different from the chemistry of the grapes back then. And also, I think a lot of people forget, but we've talked about this a lot in these seminars on Piedmont wines, that a lot of those wines from the 70s and 80s had much more, maybe it wasn't whole cluster in today's understanding of whole cluster, but stuff that today gets destemmed and taken out. But the fruit that was going into these tanks back then, questettine, in Latina, back then, it was not as clean, quote unquote. But maybe that is one of the reasons that has helped some of those wines age well, and that they could handle the oak, because the trend is definitely towards less time in oak for wines all over the world. But before we run out of time, I want to ask you one last question, because the wine is in the market now. What are your thoughts on 2016 in 1 minute?
I'm influenced by the season. I was my first season of 100% involvement and taking care of the treatments and the management of the vineyards, and it was probably one of the easiest that people remembered. Beppe Colla actually said that in the decades that he went through, 16 one of the easiest. So I was able to say, look, that it was I made it, like the thing that I'm trying to do works perfectly. So I'm influenced by it, but no, I like it. I think it's going to have a great potential, and it has a kind of a reference point in my mind for the ripening that I think it would be nice to achieve every year, just by tasting the fruit in September 16. So yeah, I've got good memories. It feels like the general average of the with all the producers is pretty great. So we'll see.
And the wines certainly have a lot of energy and that kind of structure that people, I think, like in your wines. Well, I mean, we could, I think, you probably don't want to, but we could spend much more time talking. Hopefully you'll come back sometime. It's a real pleasure to have you, Carlotta. Thanks for your time. Give our best to your mom and to your sister. And I'll finish with this glass of water that your dad always used to say that the water in Barolo has 2% alcohol. So cheers.
Cheers.
Thanks for your time.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Grazie.